Welcome to Discipleship for the Present, where we take ancient truth and bring it into clear, modern understanding. This episode uses AI-generated narration based on human-researched and written material.
It's an absolute privilege to be diving into this text today. We are looking at something that fundamentally threatens the comfortable modern way we tend to view our lives.
Yeah, it really does. Okay, let's unpack this. Imagine, walking into your neighbor's house for a dinner party.
Okay, I'm picturing it.
So you walk into the living room, and mounted on the wall, right above their television, is this beautiful mahogany display case.
Right.
And inside that case are perfectly preserved living human eyes and human hands.
Oh, wow. That's horrifying.
Exactly. And your neighbor sees you staring and says, "Oh, yeah, I just had some extra spare eyes and hands lying around, so I thought they'd make a great decoration."
Right. Which sounds like an absolute horror movie.
It does. Your immediate reaction would be that this person is a total monster because somewhere in your city, someone is blind. Somewhere. Someone is an amputee who can't feed their family. And your neighbor is keeping the very organs that could give them life and sight just to, look at them on a wall. I mean, it is grotesque.
It's a profoundly disturbing image. And what's fascinating here is that the author of the classic Christian text we are evaluating today uses that exact visceral scenario to describe the modern Christian's bank account.
That is the absolute gut punch of this entire deep dive. We are looking at chapters 6 through 11 of this historic, incredibly intense manual for a devout and holy life.
Right. And it does not pull any punches.
Not all. And the mission you and I have today, and, the mission for everyone listening, is to act as mentors and theological judges. We aren't just here to summarize this guy's intense opinion.
No, we have to evaluate them.
Exactly. We were evaluating his claims against the ultimate, absolute standard of Jesus Christ. We are going to hold his teachings up against Jesus's 8 core instructions for discipleship.
Which are, just to remind everyone, repentance and faith, self-denial and cross-bearing, total devotion, humility and service, the law of love, secret obedience, forgiveness, and fruitfulness.
Right. But before we even get to that evaluation, we need some context.
Yeah.
Because this guy is intense.
He is. And to even begin evaluating his claims against those 8 pillars, we have to look at the historical and human context of his spiritual burden. Why is he writing with this level of urgency and, frankly, aggression?
Yeah, what's his deal?
Well, he is speaking directly to a culture of deeply entrenched nominal Christianity. This is an era where there was a state church.
So everyone was
Literally everyone is baptized. Everyone went to church on Sunday because it was socially and culturally required to be a respectable citizen.
So he's looking out at pews completely packed with people who, sing the hymns, who recite the creeds. They might even serve on the church board.
Right. They check all the religious boxes.
But the horrifying reality he diagnoses is that they spend the other 6 days of the week completely governed by the exact same worldly passions as someone who has never even heard the name of Jesus.
Yes. They are chasing status. They're gossiping. They're hoarding wealth. They are, obsessed with their physical appearance.
And the central thesis of his text, the absolute heart of his message, is that the greatest threat to the church isn't flagrant criminal sin.
If we connect this to the bigger picture of our own cultural moment, that is exactly where the text becomes incredibly relevant. He isn't writing to murderers or bank robbers or people committing high treason.
Right.
He is desperately trying to wake up people who are dying a slow, imperceptible spiritual death. And it's caused by the misuse of what he calls lawful and innocent things.
Lawful and innocent? Like what?
We are talking about eating, resting, buying clothes, outfitting a home, and recreational entertainment. He is trying to form a reader who is religiously exact in the mundane details of their life.
And that brings us right back to the spare eyes and hands, because the author argues that God gives us resources, money, time, influence.
Mm-hmm.
And once your basic reasonable needs are met, meaning basic shelter, modest clothing, and sufficient food to keep you healthy, every single dollar left over is a spare eye.
Wow.
Right? If you use that excess wealth to buy a luxury car or to remodel a perfectly functional kitchen just to keep up with current design trends or to fund an endless stream of digital entertainment, you are doing the exact same thing as the psychopath with the display case of hands.
It's a completely terrifying comparison.
You are withholding sight from the blind and bread from the starving just to amuse yourself.
The author perfectly aligns here with Jesus's core instruction of total devotion. Think of the psychological mechanism behind how we view our money. We tend to view our income as our personal property.
Oh, yeah, it's mine.
Exactly. We think it's ours, and we generously choose to share a percentage of it with God. The author is demanding a total paradigm shift. You are not an owner. You are an agent of distribution.
An agent of distribution. I love that.
Every dollar in your possession is capital given by a king to be invested in the kingdom. When you spend excess capital on frivolous vanity, you aren't just making a neutral, harmless choice.
You're burying the talent in the ground.
You're taking medicine meant to heal a dying neighbor and swallowing it yourself when you aren't even sick. And the biological and spiritual result of doing that is that you actually poison yourself with pride and worldly affection.
We really have to move this from abstract theology into flesh and blood because the author does this brilliantly. He gives us character studies that, they feel like they were written yesterday.
They really do. Let's look at the tale of two sisters.
Yes, Beth and Miranda. Both of them inherit a massive fortune. Let's evaluate Beth against the instructions of total devotion and self-denial.
Okay, lay out Beth's life for us.
So Beth is pulling in an income of about $120,000 a year from her inheritance. By any modern standard, she is living the comfortable suburban dream. She buys a new car every few years. She spends a lot of time and money at the gym and on high-end skincare, largely to preserve her youth and vanity. She reads popular fiction, she goes out to the movies, she buys the clothes that are in season.
And crucially, she considers herself an incredibly devout Christian. She never misses a Sunday service. She is highly opinionated about theology, and she loves to complain about heretics or progressive drift in the culture.
Oh, she loves a good theological debate. But
Right.
if you sit with her in her beautiful living room on a Sunday afternoon, the conversation inevitably drifts into vicious gossip.
Right.
She knows exactly whose marriage is falling apart, who is secretly in debt, and whose kids are making a mess of their lives.
Typical Sunday afternoon for a lot of people, sadly.
Yeah. And regarding that $120,000 a year, if a charity she actually likes corners her, she might reluctantly hand over $10 or $20, but she will immediately complain about how tight things are because she has credit card debt from her last vacation.
And how does she view the poor?
She vehemently refuses to give money to people on the street. Why? Because she has convinced herself that they are all addicts or cheats who will just waste the money. She frames her lack of generosity as a tender conscience. She says she's just being a good, discerning steward by not encouraging bad behavior.
The author calculates that over her lifetime, she will spend millions of dollars purely on her own comfort and give away a few loose bills. And his conclusion is that Beth has absolutely no biblical foundation to believe she is a Christian or that she is going to heaven.
Wait. I really need to stop and push back on this because I guarantee you the person listening right now has a friend exactly like Beth. Or, maybe they are looking in the mirror and seeing Beth.
It's very possible.
And the immediate psychological defense is, wait, Beth isn't a criminal. She's a good person. She isn't doing anything evil.
Right, by society's standards.
Yeah, reading a romance novel isn't a sin. Having a gym membership isn't a sin. Going to church and caring about theology isn't a sin. She's a law-abiding, functional member of society. Why does this author aggressively condemn her to hell just for being normal?
Because the author is forcing us to reckon with the actual terrifying words of Jesus regarding self-denial. Jesus didn't say, if anyone would come after me, let him avoid criminal behavior.
Good point.
He said, let him deny himself and take up his cross daily. The author's premise is based on the concept of the occupied heart. Christianity, by its very nature, cannot take possession of a human heart if that heart is already fully occupied by a regular, uninterrupted love of the world and self-indulgence.
The occupied heart. Man, that completely changes the framing. She doesn't have to be a murderer to be separated from God. She just has to be entirely full of herself.
Precisely the point. Let's look at the mechanics of Beth's life. The human brain is wired to seek dopamine through status, through comfort and security. Every time Beth buys the new car to maintain her image or gossips to elevate her social standing over her peers, she is feeding the flesh.
Yeah.
Her heart is a cup filled to the brim with her own comfort. There is physically and spiritually no room for the gospel of Jesus Christ to enter.
She thinks she has room for both, though.
She believes she can serve two masters, but total devotion dictates that you cannot serve God and money. Beth loves her comfort because she fundamentally refuses to deny her flesh in the mundane, everyday choices of how she spends her time and money. She renders herself incapable of receiving the true, life-altering power of the Holy Spirit.
Wow.
Her religion is entirely an intellectual exercise. It has never pierced her occupied heart.
That is deeply convicting. She's using lawful things, a nice house, a decent wardrobe, a bit of relaxation, to slowly choke out the word of God in her life. The weeds are just designer weeds.
Designer weeds. I like that.
Yeah. Now contrast this immediately with her sister Miranda. Miranda also has $120,000 a year, but her life is a radical, almost incomprehensible opposite.
Let's evaluate Miranda through the lens of the law of love and fruitfulness. What are the actual mechanics of her daily life?
Well, she lives on a minuscule fraction of her income. She calculates the absolute minimum she needs for basic, nutritious food, a modest place to sleep, and simple, functional clothing.
And the rest?
Every single cent beyond that is entirely redirected to the poor. She views herself simply as one of the poor people that her fortune was designed by God to help.
That's a profound shift in identity.
It really is. She actively searches out families who are about to be evicted and pays their rent. She finds young people who are stuck in cycles of poverty and funds their trade education. She finds small business owners going bankrupt and bails them out. Every decision, what time she wakes up, what she wears, who she speaks to, is passed through the filter of, does this advance the kingdom of God?
She is the embodiment of total devotion. She has destroyed the artificial barrier we construct between the sacred and the secular.
Right.
There is no God's time on Sunday morning and Miranda's time on Friday night. It is all God's capital.
And what makes Miranda so compelling is that she isn't just a miserable ascetic sitting in an empty room staring at a wall. Her self-denial overflows into explosive, radical, outward action. This is where the text just blew my mind.
How so?
The author makes a theological connection regarding the instruction of forgiveness that I had never, ever considered.
Oh, you're referring to the 70 times 7 rule.
Yeah.
Walk us through how he connects Matthew 18 to our financial ledgers.
So in Matthew 18, Peter asks Jesus how many times he has to forgive his brother. 7 times. And Jesus says, no, 70 times 7.
Right.
Jesus is saying that forgiveness isn't a math equation you eventually finish. It must be a perpetual, unending state of the heart. You don't get to stop forgiving your spouse today just because you already forgave them yesterday.
And the author takes that unshakable truth and applies it directly to giving. He argues that the rule of forgiving is the exact same rule as giving.
If we unpack the logic there, it is airtight, but it is terrifying to the modern wallet.
It is absolutely terrifying. He argues that if you have the power to help, you are eternally obligated to help. You cannot stop giving to someone in need just because you already helped them last week.
Right.
You don't get a pass because you put a sizable check in the offering plate at Christmas. The author asks this piercing rhetorical question. Is it he who has once assisted a prisoner or once donated to help relieve the poor who is charitable?
No, that makes as much sense as saying a man who prayed one time in 1998 is a man devoted to God. Charity has to be the habitual, continuous, unrelenting exercise of your daily life.
That leads directly to the core instruction of fruitfulness. Jesus said, a tree is known by its fruit. A disciple's character is identified by the ongoing, compounding actions that erupt from a regenerated heart.
And Miranda's life has that fruit.
It is deeply fruitful because she doesn't just treat charity as a sterile transaction. The text provides this incredible, gritty example. Miranda walks past a house in her town, and she hears a husband and wife screaming, cursing, and throwing things.
Oh, man.
It's a completely toxic, broken environment, and their 3 young children are crying in the middle of it.
Now, let's pause and think about Beth for a second. Beth would have walked past that house, crossed the street, judged the parents, gossiped about them at her next Sunday gathering, and used their behavior as proof that they didn't deserve any financial help. But Miranda
operates on a completely different software system. She goes to the house the very next day. She doesn't lecture the parents. She offers to take the 3 children into her own home during the day for an entire year to protect them from the psychological ruin of that environment.
That is wild.
She feeds them, cares for them, teaches them, and prays with them. And the compounding fruit of that action. The text notes that these children grow up to follow Jesus, and the oldest child actually ends up leading those same screaming, toxic parents to salvation years later.
Oh.
That is what fruitfulness looks like. That is the law of love, tearing down generational strongholds.
Here's where it gets really interesting and where the author just obliterates the modern concept of philanthropy. Miranda actively gives her money to common beggars, to strangers, to people who are dirty and ungrateful. She does not demand a background check. She doesn't demand a urine test to ensure they won't use the $5 for alcohol.
Which goes against every piece of financial advice given to modern Christians. Why does she do it?
She looks at the biblical precedent. She remembers the beggar Lazarus in Luke 16, who was covered in sores and carried by angels to Abraham's bosom. She remembers Peter and John healing the lame beggar at the beautiful gate. But the theological mechanism behind her action is what wrecked me. The author reminds us that God makes the sun rise on the evil and on the good. He sends rain on the fields of the just and the unjust alike. And then he poses this devastating scenario.
Okay, let's hear it.
You and I pray every single day. We look up to heaven and we beg God, please treat me with mercy. Do not treat me according to my merit. Please do not give me what I actually deserve.
Yes, that is the core of our faith.
And yet we turn around, look at a homeless man on the street, and we demand that he prove his merit before we give him $5.
It's cognitive dissonance of the highest order. We demand a standard of judgment for the poor that would instantly damn our own souls to hell if God applied it to us.
Yes, we cannot withhold charity from a broken, possibly addicted neighbor because he doesn't deserve our money, while simultaneously banking our entire eternal destiny on the fact that God won't withhold grace from us when we don't deserve it. It is the ultimate rotting hypocrisy.
As powerful as this is, we have to address the massive elephant in the room. Because a listener driving in their car right now or, folding laundry is thinking, okay, Miranda is an incredible saint.
Right.
But Miranda sounds like a vocational missionary. She sounds like a nun who doesn't have a 9-to-5 job, a mortgage, or a 401k to manage. This level of total devotion is beautiful for the clergy or the radical few, but I have a normal life. God understands that I can't live like this.
The clergy exception. The deep-seated belief that there is a varsity team of Christians who have to be holy and a junior varsity team who just have to be nice. The author actually anticipates this perfectly. He introduces us to a character named Kent.
How does Kent measure up against the instruction of total devotion for all believers?
Well, Kent is a highly educated, wealthy guy. He has university degrees. He's cultured. But he intentionally avoids going into Christian ministry. He even avoids getting married and starting a family.
Why that?
Because he is terrified of the rules. He wants an idle, independent, friction-free life where he can just chill. He thinks that because he doesn't have the title of pastor and because he isn't the head of a household, he is completely off the hook.
So he just floats through life.
Exactly. He considers himself a good Christian, but he thinks he has a hall pass to avoid living a rigorously holy life because he is just a regular guy.
It is the delusion of neutrality.
Yeah.
Kent believes that because he isn't actively doing evil, his idleness is somehow acceptable to God.
And the author destroys this delusion with a brilliant analogy. Kent thinks he's harmless because he isn't out defrauding people or committing violence. He's just playing video games, taking vacations, and enjoying his wealth.
Right.
But the author says that choosing to be a lazy, worldly pleasure seeker rather than injuring a neighbor is like choosing to rob a house instead of a church.
Oh, man. This completely reframes our theology of sin. Robbing a house and robbing a church are both felonies. They're both fundamental rebellions against the law.
Exactly. Wait, I shouldn't say exactly, because the implication is actually far worse.
Yeah.
You don't get a medal from a judge for choosing to rob a civilian instead of a priest.
No, you definitely don't.
And the author is saying you don't get a pat on the back from God for choosing to be worldly, vain, and obsessed with your own comfort instead of choosing to be a bank robber. They're both direct rebellions against the design God has for human nature.
If we connect this to the bigger picture of our own cultural moment, we see how deeply we have bought into Kent's mindset. We look at an embezzler and we think, what a terrible sinner. He needs Jesus.
Yeah.
But we look at a guy who wastes 40 hours a week on video games, blows his entire paycheck on sports cars and fine dining, ignores the poor in his city, and we think, hey, he's living the dream. Good for him.
We celebrate him.
The author argues that both men are equally repulsive to the holiness of God.
Yeah.
You were created to glorify your maker. If you don't do that, you are in open rebellion, whether you wear a clerical collar or a plumber's uniform.
The author drives the nail in by saying that the businessman, the soldier, the tech worker, the rich, and the poor are all called to the exact same uncompromising standard of holiness as the most devout apostle. There is no clergy exception for fruitfulness.
None.
We are all praying to enter the exact same heaven. Therefore, we must all walk the exact same narrow path of holiness to get there.
It is an incredibly heavy burden to place on the listener, but it aligns flawlessly with Jesus' core instruction. Whoever does not bear his own cross and come after me cannot be my disciple. He didn't say, whichever pastor does not bear his cross. He said, whoever.
Okay, as deeply convicting as this text is, and as much as it aligns with Christ's call, our job as mentors today is also to exercise discernment.
Absolutely.
This text was written by a fallible human being in a specific historical moment, and frankly, there are places where this text rubs very uncomfortably against the full counsel of Jesus' instructions. We need to look at the gaps, the tensions, and the imbalances.
This is a vital part of discipleship. We cannot just swallow any historical text whole without chewing on it and spitting out the bones. There are two significant tensions that arise when we measure this text against the 8 core instructions. Let's start with the instruction of secret obedience.
Okay, I am so glad we are talking about this because I really struggled here. Jesus is explicitly clear in the Sermon on the Mount regarding secret obedience. He commands that our fasting, our praying, and our giving must be done in secret.
Yes, Matthew 6.
Matthew 6 says, "Do not let your left hand know what your right hand is doing, so that your giving may be in secret, and your Father who sees in secret will reward you."
Jesus warns that if you do your righteous deeds to be seen by men, you have received your reward in full. The applause of the crowd is all you will ever get.
But look at how the author paints Miranda. Her life is presented as highly, visibly pious. The text goes out of its way to say there is hardly a poor family in her entire neighborhood who doesn't wear a piece of clothing she made. Everyone in town knows she pays the rent for the struggling families. Her neat and modest dress is publicly noted and admired by the author. She is this glowing public beacon of charity.
Right.
So I have to ask, doesn't the authors need to create this visible, perfect model of piety directly violate Christ's command to remain unseen by men?
It is a very sharp critique, and it exposes the tension between two of Jesus' commands. Because on the one hand, Jesus demands secret obedience. But on the other hand, just one chapter earlier in Matthew 5, Jesus commands, "Let your light shine before others, so that they may see your good works and give glory to your Father who is in heaven."
That's true. So how do we reconcile that?
The tension lies entirely in the psychological motive of the heart. Is Miranda paying rent so that she can walk through town and have people whisper about how holy she is? The author would adamantly argue no, she is doing it purely for God's glory.
I hear you on the motive, and I know the author's intent is to show a city on a hill, but I have to push back again because it still feels dangerously close to spiritual pride.
I see what you mean.
If everyone in town knows she bought those clothes, and everyone is praising her modesty, isn't she just trading worldly vanity for spiritual vanity? Isn't she getting her reward right now in the form of a stellar reputation?
The danger is absolutely real, and your pushback is exactly why modern readers must be careful. The author, in his zeal to make Miranda the ultimate countercultural example, paints a picture of a woman whose good deeds are universally known.
Almost too perfect.
Exactly. For a modern listener trying to apply this, we have to guard our hearts fiercely against virtue signaling. In the age of social media where people film themselves giving money to the homeless for views, the pull toward performative charity is stronger than ever.
Yes, the performative aspect is huge today.
The spirit of Jesus' instruction pushes us towards strict anonymity whenever possible. We shouldn't aspire to have the neighborhood know we paid a family's rent. We should aspire to have only God know, specifically to protect our own hearts from the toxic pride of playing the neighborhood savior.
That distinction is crucial. Protect your own heart by hiding your good deeds. But there is a second tension in this text that genuinely bothered me, and it has to do with the author's complete rejection of joy and rest.
Yes. While self-denial is a non-negotiable core instruction, the author of this text pushes it to an extreme that crosses the line into unbiblical asceticism. He equates almost all entertainment, all sports, and all recreation to foolishness.
Which seems extreme.
She even takes a swing at youth groups having fun, suggesting they should put away their games and spend all their time raking leaves and tending to the sick.
Look, I am all for youth groups serving the community. But pizza, games, and laughter have a biblical place, don't they? The author seems to miss the entire biblical theology of joyful feasting.
He really does.
Jesus' very first miracle wasn't healing a leper. It was keeping a massive wedding party going by miraculously creating hundreds of gallons of top-tier wine. The Pharisees actually accused Jesus of being a glutton and a drunkard because he was constantly eating, drinking, and celebrating with people.
A friend of sinners.
Exactly. Furthermore, God himself instituted the Sabbath, a mandatory day of actual rest, joy, and enjoyment of creation.
If we connect this to the overarching narrative of Scripture, we see that God created a deeply material, sensory world and called it good. The author of our text is so hyper-focused on the legitimate dangers of worldliness that he treats the physical world and any enjoyment of it as inherently suspicious.
Right, like all pleasure is automatically a sin.
He writes that anything we spend on our own indulgence simply helps to dull our hearts. He lumps almost all music, art, and recreation into that category. As mentors, we have to help the listener navigate the razor-thin line between necessary self-denial and joyless legalism.
Yeah, we have to find that balance.
It is not a sin to be moved to tears by a beautiful symphony. It is not a sin to bond with your children over a baseball game. It's not a sin to eat an incredibly well-prepared steak, provided those experiences lead your heart to erupt in gratitude toward the Creator rather than becoming idols you worship.
So the goal of discipleship is about ordering our loves properly, not eradicating our humanity. We don't have to pretend that having a hobby is a one-way ticket to hell as long as it doesn't take the throne of our hearts.
Exactly. The human heart is meant to sing, to rest, and to enjoy the gifts of God. We just can't love the gifts more than the giver.
Okay, let's bring this entirely into the present moment. Taking these ancient, intense, sometimes rigid ideals, how do we practically apply them to the extreme complexities of the 21st century? So what does this all mean for the listener today?
Let's start by translating the author's critique of the institutional church. He is incredibly sharp when he looks at how religious institutions allocate their capital.
He calls out churches that are building massive, fancy facilities, installing giant LED screens, and putting on million-dollar light shows for their own entertainment, while people in their immediate communities and around the world are starving.
Yes.
This is a devastating challenge to the modern megachurch culture.
It forces us to evaluate our corporate budgets against the instructions of humility and service and the law of love. Are our churches operating as exclusive country clubs for believers to consume religious goods? Or are they operating as trauma hospitals and resource distribution centers for the broken?
That's a powerful question.
The psychology of the modern church often mirrors consumer capitalism. We want comfortable seats, great coffee, and a polished performance. The author is demanding we compare what a church spends on its own internal amusement versus what it spends on true evangelism and the marginalized.
And if the ratio is heavily skewed?
If the ratio is heavily skewed towards self-entertainment, that church is acting exactly like Beth, not Miranda.
And what's terrifying is that this corporate critique translates directly to our personal household budgets. The author has a very specific challenge regarding how we clothe ourselves. Now, as we established, he leans toward asceticism, so we aren't arguing that everyone needs to wear identical, drab, gray uniforms.
But we're not saying that.
But the translation for a modern listener is the psychological battle of the $80 pants versus the $30 pants.
Unpack the mechanics of that decision for us. Why do we buy the $80 pants?
Let's look at the reality. You need pants. That is a legitimate basic human need. You go to the store and you see a pair of functional, durable pants for $30. Right next to them is a pair of pants with a specific designer logo on the pocket for $80.
Okay, pretty standard shopping trip.
Both pairs cover your body perfectly. Both pairs will last for years. But human evolutionary biology, hijacked by modern marketing, screams at you to buy the $80 pair. Why? Because that logo signals status to your tribe. It tells people you have disposable income. It feeds your vanity.
And what does the author say about that extra $50?
He says that if you choose the $80 pants, you are actively choosing your own vanity over the physical life of your neighbor. Because that extra $50 could be used to buy a week's worth of groceries for a single mother. It could buy diapers for a struggling family in your church. The author is saying that when you pay for the logo, you are taking the spare eyes and hands that belong to the poor, and you are wearing them on your legs to make yourself look cool.
That is a piercing, uncomfortable application of total devotion. It means that every single financial decision at Target or on Amazon is fundamentally a spiritual decision.
Every single one.
And what's fascinating here is how the author connects this outward mundane behavior of shopping directly to the intimacy of our inward prayer life. He launches a scathing critique of the cognitive dissonance we experience in our prayers.
Oh, this is the commuter analogy. Every modern Christian will recognize themselves in this.
Picture a professional commuting to their office on a Tuesday morning. They have their favorite upbeat Christian worship music playing through the car speakers. They're singing along. They have their hands on the steering wheel, and they offer up a passionate, sincere prayer for God to guide them, to give them a heart of humility, and to bless their day.
Sounds like a great morning.
Right. They feel a genuine spiritual high in the cabin of that car. But then they pull into the parking garage, and for the next 8 hours, they viciously complain about their boss's incompetence. They gossip with their coworkers to gain social leverage. They are consumed with anxiety about their retirement portfolio, and they snap at the barista who messes up their lunch order.
The author argues that if our everyday mundane life doesn't match the soaring spirit of our morning prayers, those prayers are nothing but empty, offensive lip labor. It is notorious hypocrisy.
Jesus' instruction on repentance and faith demands a total structural reorientation of the entire human life, not just the isolated religious moments in the car or the pew. You cannot pray sincerely if you live insincerely.
It's all connected.
The author writes, you pray on bended knees while you are clothed with pride. You speak heavenly petitions while you are hoarding up treasures upon earth. He's saying that the way you treat the barista and the way you manage your 401k either validates or invalidates the words you spoke to God that morning.
Which naturally brings us to the ultimate burning question that is likely forming in the mind of the listener right now. Because if someone is listening to this, evaluating the $30 pants, contemplating the terror of the 70/7 giving rule, guarding against the cognitive dissonance of the commuter, they are probably thinking, won't living this strictly make me absolutely miserable?
That is the question.
If I am constantly policing every dollar and every thought, this sounds like a joyless, heavy, exhausting slog.
It is the most common and perhaps the most honest objection to radical discipleship. The world relentlessly preaches that giving up innocent pleasures and self-indulgence will make your life gray and dull. But the author unpacks the psychology of this beautifully.
How does he explain it?
He argues that our misery, our constant anxiety, our vexation, our sleepless nights, and our complaining is not caused by a lack of pleasure. It is caused entirely by our unbridled passions.
He introduces a final character, Rhonda, to prove this psychosomatic point. Rhonda is incredibly wealthy. She doesn't have to work a day in her life. By the world's standards, she has achieved absolute freedom. And yet...
But she is constantly exhausted. She is chronically complaining, and she is profoundly miserable. Why? Not because she lacks food or shelter. She is miserable because somebody at a high society party didn't pay enough attention to her. Or someone with slightly less money got seated at a better table than her.
Incredible.
Her pride and her envy are literally spiking her cortisol levels and making her physically ill. The text notes she actually has to call a doctor because her vanity was wounded. The author observes that she has no actual business upon her hands except to receive her massive income, yet she acts with the panic and stress of someone who has neither food nor lodging.
Rhonda is the ultimate cautionary tale of the occupied heart. She is miserable precisely because her passions, pride, envy, the need for social validation are unbridled. When we reject the instruction of self-denial, we don't become free. What happens? We subject ourselves to 1,000 imaginary tyrannical needs. If you need everyone to think you are wealthy, you will live in constant terror of losing your wealth. To drive this point home, the author uses 3 of the most brilliant, poignant analogies I have ever read. They perfectly illustrate how our worldly passions make us look utterly ridiculous to God.
Oh, I love these. Walk us through them.
First, he talks about a man who decides he wants to fly. This man spends his entire life flapping his arms violently. He climbs up steep hills, he begs people to lift him up into the air, he repeatedly jumps off ledges and bruises himself with terrible falls, all because he desperately wants the glory of having people look up at him soaring in the sky.
Okay.
It's completely absurd and pathetic, right? But the author says that is exactly what the person who chases worldly honor looks like to the angels.
Think about the modern equivalent. The person who spends hours perfectly curating an Instagram post, agonizing over the lighting, desperately checking their phone every 3 minutes to see how many likes they received.
Yes.
They're jumping off a hill, flapping their arms, bruising their own psyche, chasing a fleeting imaginary honor that they were never designed to need.
The second analogy is the man dying of thirst next to his own pond. Imagine a man who owns a massive, deep pond of fresh, clean water. But he is literally dying of dehydration on the shore because he refuses to take a single sip.
Why won't he drink?
He is terrified that if he drinks, the water level might drop a fraction of an inch. He spends his entire miserable life carrying buckets of water from miles away to add to his pond, sweating and anxious about every drop of rain, and he eventually dies of thirst right next to millions of gallons of water.
It is the perfect psychological profile of covetousness.
Yeah.
The hoarder of wealth who can never actually enjoy the peace of security because they are too terrified of losing a single dollar.
Exactly.
They obsess over their retirement accounts, terrified of a market dip, hoarding capital they will never live to spend, while their soul dehydrates and their neighbors starve.
And the final analogy, which is my absolute favorite, the
Yeah.
ignorant man who has bread, clean water, and a pouch of gold dust. He is starving and thirsty, but he doesn't understand what the items are for. So he takes the gold dust and he rubs it directly into his eyes.
Oh, man. Ouch.
It blinds him and causes him excruciating agony. Then, to cure his hunger, he tries to eat handfuls of gravel instead of the bread. The author is saying this is exactly what we do when we take the wealth of this world, which God designed to be used as a practical tool to feed the poor, and we rub it into our eyes.
Wow.
We try to use material wealth to satisfy our deep spiritual hunger, and it just blinds us to reality and leaves us choking on gravel.
This raises an important question about the nature of God's commands. The author argues that if a doctor gives you a rule that says, never put gold dust in your eyes, you don't throw a tantrum and complain that the doctor's too strict.
Right.
You don't whine about your lack of freedom. You recognize that the rule is the very thing saving you from blindness and agony.
Exactly. We don't say, oh, God is so rigid and mean, he won't even let me put a little bit of gold dust in my eyes on the weekends.
God's laws, the instructions of self-denial, humility, and total devotion are exactly like the doctor's rule. They are not arbitrary, cruel tests designed by a cosmic killjoy to make us miserable.
No, they're not.
They are the manufacturer's operating instructions for human flourishing. They protect us from the spiritual blindness, the exhaustion, and the choking misery of trying to find our ultimate joy in temporary things that were never, ever meant to satisfy us.
So where is joy found?
True joy, the text fiercely argues, is only found by the one who multiplies their talents for the kingdom. It is found by the one who eventually hears, "Well done, good and faithful servant, enter into the joy of your master."
So as we bring this deep dive to a close, we have to land the plane practically. We cannot just listen to this and move on. How do we actually examine our own discipleship based on these terrifying and beautiful truths? We have 3 practical steps for you to take this week.
It's the first one.
First, audit your lawful things. I want you to literally pull up your bank statement and your digital calendar for the last 30 days. Look at the hard data, how much time and money went toward worldly amusement, status signaling, and self-indulgence, versus how much went toward the law of love and materially helping the broken. Do not trust your feelings. Be brutally honest with the math.
Second, examine the why of your wardrobe and your possessions. The next time you make a purchase, pause and interrogate your motives.
Like the $80 pants.
Exactly. Are you buying for utility, modesty, and stewardship? Or are you spending that extra $50 to feed a hidden pride, to fit into a specific socioeconomic tribe, and to signal your status to people who don't actually care about you?
And third, the 70 by 7 giving challenge. Think of someone in your immediate sphere who is in need: a struggling single parent, an elderly neighbor on a fixed income, or a local grassroots charity. Who can you help repeatedly this month? And here's the hardest part. Can you do it without demanding a background check on their merit?
That is tough.
Can you extend the exact same unearned, scandalous grace to them that you will beg God to extend to you tonight?
Those are difficult, painful, but deeply necessary reflections if we're going to take Jesus' instructions as reality rather than poetry.
We've covered an immense amount of ground today, diving into the psychology of wealth, the danger of the occupied heart, and the radical call of total devotion. But before we sign off, I know you have a final provocative thought for our listeners to mull over, building on that parable of the talents.
I do. Throughout this text, the author focuses heavily on financial wealth and time as the primary talents we are given to invest.
Right.
But if the core premise holds true, that everything we have is capital given by God, how might our entire paradigm shift if we applied this to the intangible gifts? Think about your physical health. Think about your high IQ.
Oh, wow.
Think about your college education, your emotional resilience, and your powerful social networks. What would happen if you stopped viewing those things as personal assets to protect and leverage for your own career advancement, and started viewing them entirely as capital to be invested for the poor and the marginalized?
That completely flicks everything.
What if your healthy, energetic body and your sharp mind are the spare eyes and hands that rightfully belong to the exhausted and the broken in your city?
Wow. That completely dismantles everything. That changes how I view my entire existence. That's the heart of this section. This is Discipleship for the Present, where understanding leads to clarity, and clarity shapes how we see and live. We'll see you in the next episode.